In his book, The Disappearance of Childhood, Neil Postman, who is a professor at New York University, in the last chapter raises and answers a number of questions about what is happening in our society as childhood disappears. And the last question that he raises is this. He says, is the individual powerless to resist what is happening? And then he answers it in this way. He says, the answer to this, in my opinion, is no. But as with all resistance, there is a price to pay. Specifically, resistance entails conceiving parenting as an act of rebellion against American culture. Let me read that to you again. That Postman says that in light of what is happening in our culture, that if you're going to effectively raise children, you need to know this, that resistance conceives of parenting as an act of rebellion against American culture. For example, for parents merely to remain married is in itself an act of disobedience and an insult to the spirit of a throwaway culture in which continuity has little value. It is also at least 90% un-American to remain in close proximity to one's extended family so that children can experience daily the meaning of kinship and the value of deference and responsibility to elders. Similarly, to insist that one's children learn the discipline of delayed gratification or modesty in their sexuality or self-restraint in manners, language, and style is to place oneself in opposition to almost every social trend. Even further, to ensure that one's children work hard at becoming literate is extraordinarily time-consuming and even expensive. But most rebellious of all is the attempt to control the media's access to one's children. There are, in fact, two ways to do this. The first is to limit the amount of exposure children have to media. The second is to monitor carefully what they are exposed to and to provide them with a continuously running critique of the themes and values of the media's content. Both are very difficult to do and require a level of attention that most parents are not prepared to give to child rearing. Nonetheless, there are parents who are committed to doing all of these things, who are, in effect, defying the directives of their culture. I don't know that Postman is a Christian or is writing even from a Christian point of view. But he said if you're going to be an effective parent, you're going to have to stand in rebellion against the culture in which you live. That's a remarkable statement. Most of us would think that America stands on our side, that our culture is somehow Christian. It is not. And if you're going to, as we've suggested, raise young men and women to be godly in an ungodly society, we need to have a biblical worldview. We need to have a worldview, a perspective like the perspective that Moses' parents had, that when they saw their child, they looked at him and they saw him from a biblical perspective, and they made a commitment to raise him within the context of that biblical worldview, that biblical framework, that place at which they stood and from which they viewed all of life, how they worked, why they worked, where they lived, what they did with time and resources, how their child and child rearing fit into that whole biblical perspective. And you remember that we said that means that they had an understanding in the light of that broad vision that they had from a biblical point of view of who they were in their culture, that they were not Egyptians, they were God's people. And we must understand who we are in our culture if we are to raise a godly generation in the midst of an ungodly society. It is compelling for us not only because of the pressures that we are experiencing, but let me quote to you what is happening in our society even as a result of a moral breakdown in the area of sexuality. A quote from the editorial page of the Washington Times Insight magazine. The writer says we are hopelessly muddled when it comes to the subject of sex and teenagers. One generation after a revolution in consciousness that demystified sex and liberated it and us from the shackles of Victorian morality. One generation after abortions became freely available and contraceptives became easily obtainable. One generation after the introduction of sex education in most of our major school systems, and the United States has the highest teen pregnancy rate in the Western world. Contraceptives have not helped. Sex education has not helped. Even the most passionate religious foes of abortion would surely accept that easy access to it might produce a lower illegitimacy rate. One of the reasons it was originally given such emotional credence was, supposedly, to prevent young teenage girls from aborting their fetuses with coat hangers. But no, abortion is apparently not used well, even as a means of teenage birth control. All this is certainly reason enough to worry, and has been for quite some time. But now we are told the lives of our teenagers are at deadly risk. AIDS is coming, and given teenage promiscuity, it may spread like the plague in the ranks of today's youth, destroying a generation as painfully as World War I wiped out most of Europe's youth in 4 short years. Let me tell you that AIDS is not a medical problem, it's a moral problem. It is a result of the destruction of a moral base in our society. And I want to say to you, as fellow Christians and as fellow parents, that we must know who we are in our society. That we must be people who live not from an American point of view, for the society in which we live is a society that stands against the basic Christian values that are ours if we're committed to Christ. And Moses' parents understood who they were in their society, and they did not worship Egypt's gods, and we must not worship the gods of our society. As we saw before, materialism, humanism, individualism, consumerism, hedonism. These are the gods of the society in which we live. And it may well be that we find ourselves worshiping them along with the other members of our society who do not claim the lordship of Jesus Christ over their lives and homes. They did not worship Egypt's gods. They also were not subject to Egypt's government. They were not in rebellion against the government of Egypt, but it says that they would not obey the king's edict because it would have had devastating effects upon their family. They understood that the state is not ultimate in the lives of people, that God has established government for the good of people, for the good of the governed, and a child does not belong to the state. The child does not belong to the government. It belongs to God. And we as parents have been given a stewardship over the lives of our children, not to have them live out vicariously our aspirations, but to become godly men and women. That is the stewardship, that is the responsibility that is ours as parents. But our children do not belong to the government. And we live in a society in which the government is beginning to take more and more responsibility and take over more and more of the rights of parents. A government that is becoming more involved in our lives every day. A government that is seeking to regulate even our home life more and more. The other night on the news, they reported how a father and mother in Iowa, a pastor and his wife, are going to be serving 30 days in jail. Why? Because they have decided to raise their children in a school that is not accredited by the state of Iowa. And they're going to jail for it. Not in Russia, not in Eastern Europe, but in the state of Iowa in the United States. The government of this country is becoming more involved in the lives of its people. We must understand that our children do not belong to the government. They belong to God, to be raised by us for God. I subscribe to a little paper called Persuasion at Work. It comes out once or twice a month. And one of the things that is committed to is the upholding of the integrity of the family unit. The editor of that magazine, Alan C. Carlson, in a recent edition talked about what is happening to our families in this country because of government intervention. And he lists a number of the negative results of government intervention. And then he goes on to say, campaigns against child abuse have had similar unintended results. Under existing reporting laws and given the appropriations appeal of the Stop Child Abuse cry, state welfare authorities have a strong interest in maximizing the number of reports of abuse and the number of families dragged into the system. Accordingly, in 1985 alone, at least 500,000 innocent American families were falsely accused of child abuse and were dragged to varying degrees through the indignities and subtle terrors of a state investigation into their character. 500,000 families in this country, innocent families, dragged into the system and accused of child abuse when they were not guilty. We saw this happen in our own state, not too far from here. Families accused, and then the state later dropped its case. I don't know what all the details of that situation were, but it's going to be very difficult for those families to restore again their character, their reputation in those communities when the state dragged them through a system and accused them, photographed them, brought them to court, and couldn't prove its case against them. There is growing evidence, moreover, that the very act of state intervention into the family, even for the best motives, commonly worsens an already negative situation. The psychological relationship of the child to his parents requires the privacy of family life under the guardianship of parents who are seen as autonomous. When the state intervenes and family integrity is broken, the young child's needs are denied, and his belief in his parents as omniscient is prematurely shaken. As three eminent scholars have concluded, the law does not have the capacity to supervise the fragile, complex interpersonal bonds between child and parent. The state is too crude an instrument to become an adequate substitute for flesh and blood parents. We're not suggesting that all parents are good parents. We're not suggesting that there isn't a legitimate time for the state to be concerned. But we're seeing happening in our society is the state beginning to assume that it has the right and the ownership of our children. And as Christians, we must understand that they do not. Our children do not even belong to us. They belong to God. And God gives us the great privilege, the high privilege and responsibility of raising them to be godly, to know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him. But as Moses' parents looked upon their child as he was born, because of this broad vision that they had as to who they were in their culture, this broad vision that gave them a perspective into which all of life fit, they not only understood who they were in their culture, and not only determined that, but also determined what they saw in their child. In Acts 7:20 we read that they saw that he was beautiful before God. And I want to suggest that as Moses' parents looked at their child, they saw two things. And I don't know what it is that you have seen as you have looked at your child. But if you look as they looked, you will see what they saw. And they saw, first of all, what the child Moses was born with. He was born with something. He was born with value. And we as parents need to understand that our children are born with value. They understood, as we should, that a person has value not because of what he is in himself or because of what others think of him. Moses was born under the sentence of death. But Moses' parents didn't view their child in the light of what Pharaoh thought or the society thought. They viewed him in the light of God, how God saw him and what He thought of Moses. And they saw that he was born with value. And so we look at our children and see in them value because of who they are before God. Our value does not come from anything in the world that we can acquire or that we can achieve. How important it is for us to understand that. particularly in American society, where value is tied into what you can acquire, what you can have, or what you can achieve. If you're not number one in this country, you're not anything. No one remembers who lost the Super Bowl, only who won. And we need to understand that that value system that pervades through our society is ungodly. It's demonic. It's anti-Christian. Because value is not derived from anything we can acquire in this world, nor anything that we can achieve in this world. Our value comes from who we are before God. Notice what has happened in our society as we have devalued life. We have redefined it. And we have said that the unborn have no value, that the unborn do not constitute persons. They have no value at all. They have no rights before the law. A recent ruling in California, where a woman was told while she was pregnant there are certain things she should not do. Her doctor instructed her that if she engaged in those activities, she could endanger the life of her child. She disregarded those, and the child died. And the courts found her completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Why? Because she didn't kill anything. The child is a non-person, redefined, devalued. We are trying to develop a risk-free society so that you'll be safe wherever you go. Do you know the most unsafe place in this country today for a young child to be? In his mother's womb. A place that God designed for the beginning and the developing of human life has become the unsafest place in our society, where for any reason whatsoever, or no reason at all, a child's life can be destroyed. Why? Because it's been devalued. And as we raise our children, we need to teach them that their value is not derived from what society thinks of them. It's not derived from what society thinks is valuable. It's not derived from anything this society can give them or anything this society can take away from them. Their value comes from their relationship to God, to how God sees them and how God views them. I believe that it's the responsibility of parents to treat a child in such a way that he grows to understand that he has value before God. To treat that young life in such a way that he understands that he has value before God. By the time and the energy that we make available to his raising, not that he understands that he is important in himself or he's number one in the universe, but they understand that he has value because he's been made by God. And he has value because of the way God sees him and the fact that God knows him. To treat a child in such a way that he understands that neither his or anyone else's value is based on appearance, ability, or achievement. Our responsibility as parents to raise our children to understand that their value is not based upon appearance. To do so is to go contrary to American society. Have you ever seen a homely Miss America? The whole idea is that beauty is what matters. We're repelled by age, by older people. We're repelled by that which isn't beautiful. We're repelled by that which isn't young and handsome. Look at our advertising. Beautiful, beautiful people. They're all handsome, they're all beautiful, they're all young, they're all vibrant. The whole message is that's where value comes from. It's a lie. It's satanic. And we need to stand against it in the raising of our children and treat them to understand that their value and the value of others is not based upon their appearance. It's not based upon their ability. Whether they can contribute anything to this life or not, they still have value before God. The life of a child is not to be destroyed because he has some kind of disease or some mental disability. He has value. Why? Because he's a person. But to say so is to fly in the face of this society in which we live. It may well be that we are raising our children to believe the same thing. Is that why they must have all the latest styles? Is that why they must have all the latest things? Somehow we feel that their sense of value would be undermined if they cannot keep up with everybody else. What a lie. We are destroying value. We're not enhancing it. We do our children great harm. It's not achievement in terms of what the world thinks. That each human being is equal in value because he is made in God's image with a capacity to know and be like God. That's where our value is derived from. I believe a child's sense of value is enhanced or diminished not only by how he is treated, but by how he treats others. Do you teach your children to treat other people with dignity? To treat other people as equal in value to himself because they too are made by God to know and love him? I was encouraged, somewhat challenged by what I read about a young boy, 11 years old in Philadelphia. His name is Trevor Farrell. And one night as he was watching the news, there was a segment of the news given over to what was happening to people in Philadelphia, living on the streets of Philadelphia, poor and indigent, no place to go home to, no home, no house, sleeping on the streets. And he was moved by this, and he asked his parents about it. And so they got into their car and drove not too far from where he lived. And there they saw the poor. And this young boy, 11 years old, had his favorite yellow blanket with him, and he saw a man sleeping on the street in cold. And he asked his parents to stop the car, and they get out, and he walked over, and he shook the man, and he said, "Sir, you can have my blanket." And every night after that, Trevor and his family went down and took coffee and sandwiches and clothes and blankets to feed and to clothe and to help the poor people on the streets of Philadelphia. Why? Because a young boy understood that whether you've got a home, whether you sleep on the street, whether you're poor, you're a person. Whether you're handicapped mentally or physically, you're a person. You have value because you have value before God. I want to ask you, parents, are you raising your children to understand that people have value? We see this whole thing so often pervading of looking down our nose on the young person who cannot have the clothes as good as ours, who isn't as intelligent as we, who's not as athletic as we, and it's demonic and it's destructive, and I plead with you to raise your children to understand that people have value. No matter what they look like, no matter what they own, no matter what they can do, they have value before God. And we're raising a generation of young people who are snobs, who look down their noses, and fellow students who don't have the right brand name on their clothes. Oh, I say, God help us. And we've been manipulated, we've been controlled, we've been shaped by our culture rather than our commitment to Christ. Are you raising your children to understand that their concept of their own value before God is not only a result of how they are treated, but how they treat others? Because when you diminish another person, you're diminished in the process. When you belittle another human being, you're belittled in the process. When you look down your nose at some other human being, you become lower in the process. Oh, we need as parents to teach our children that their need for affection and acceptance and approval and achievement, needs which must be met if they're to grow to become mature people, can ultimately only be met in God. We all have these needs, but they can only be met in God, not in fellow human beings, not in anything that God has made, but in God himself. That any attempt to have these needs met by someone or something else is doomed to failure and will result in disappointment and frustration. We're a nation that has more than anybody else. We're a disappointed, frustrated people. We have too much of everything and too little of what really matters. We must raise our children to understand that these basic needs can only ultimately be met in God. Dr. Robert Coase, professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, one of the leading psychiatrists in this country, has spent the last 26 years of his life studying children from poor backgrounds and affluent backgrounds. He spent years studying in the South amongst very poor families. And then later on, and he wrote a number of volumes about his experience, and then later on he switched and began to study the lives of the affluent. He said for 15 years he had heard the poor talk about them, in quotes, the privileged ones, the blessed ones, those with food on their table and doctors at their call, and an education and a couple of cars and a house of their own with no landlord. Yet what had such comfort created? Were the rich any happier, more peaceful, more grateful? And what Coase found that as he began to investigate and study and work with the children of the rich, he said among the poor he'd expected defeat and despair. He found some, but he also found strength and hope and courage. Among the rich, he had expected satisfaction. Instead, he found boredom and alienation and decadence. He says, reflecting on the rich and poor people he had gotten to know, Coase was struck with the haunting ironies of life. It was true the poor were cursed. He had treated the miners with black lung disease and the malnourished children. Yet in a strange but undeniable way, the poor were also blessed, for whatever reason, with qualities such as courage and love and a willing dependence on God. And what I find is that we, even as Christians, think that if our children are deprived, if somehow they have to go without, they will suffer. They will not grow up normal. I want to say to you that your children can go without a great deal of what this world considers necessary, or this society considers necessary, and grow up to be wonderful people. No, we have accepted a wrong set of values. I wish to tell you that putting your children into a Christian academy or seeing them go to Sunday school in itself will not do. There must be a commitment in your home to a Christian worldview that defines who you are in your culture and what you see in your child. And to see him as having value and treat him accordingly. To be willing to say no when necessary, to be willing to go without. I remember looking back as a young person, as a child growing up in a home where we had very little. Sometimes not enough coal to keep the fire burning till the next time the coal man came. Of pulling our socks down again and again and wrapping them underneath our toes so the hose and the heel would not show. Of putting newspaper into your shoes to keep the rain out because we didn't have enough money to get them fixed. But I don't remember being deprived. But I see a lot of deprived children with lots of things. More things than we would ever have dreamed possible for a person to have, and they're deprived. And if you think that by having everything and giving everything our society says you have to have, that somehow that will bring satisfaction to your children, you're making a tragic, tragic mistake. It is the values, the Christian values, the biblical values, built into their lives that produce character. And we need parents who are clear-eyed, who can see a vision that our society doesn't see, who can make decisions for the lives of their children and their own lives based upon that clear vision. We are to raise our children to know and understand that the source of all true and lasting value is God alone. We should remember, however, that a child learns more by what he sees than by what we say. He learns more by example than by our exhortations and our edicts. We can tell him one thing and completely deny it by how we live. That if we've accepted the values of our society and we are living for what our society says is important, it doesn't matter what you tell your children, that's the message that will come through. That's what will shape their lives. What they see in our lives. But when they begin to see godly parents committed to godly values, what a difference. What a difference. What do you see in your child? What do you see when you look at your children? Do you see them before God? Let me close with a quote from C.S. Lewis as he talks about human beings in general. And I'd like to apply it to our children. It's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, our friendships, our loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, art, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. You're raising an everlasting splendor. That's the opportunity you have as a parent, to raise an everlasting splendor for God. Are you raising an everlasting splendor for God in your family? Someone who is going to express the beauty and the wonder of what God is like and what life is all about. It begins with a vision, a broad vision, centered in the Lordship of Jesus Christ, encompassing all of life and reaching down into the basic elements of our home. And as we look at our children, understanding who they are before God, understanding what they have, a value that He has given, and as we treat Him in the light of that value and teach Him how to treat others in the light of that value, to see them become splendid for God. That's what God is after. That's what God is calling us to. What a privilege, what a responsibility. But by His grace we can do it. But remember, parenting in our society is an act of rebellion against our culture. I'm looking for rebels. I'm calling for rebellion against our culture. In Jesus' name, let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank You for the great privilege of being raised by parents who loved You, who said no to the wrong things and yes to the right things because they had a vision. They went beyond the narrow vision of our culture, who raised us to be splendid before You. Oh God, thank You. I pray for parents in this congregation this morning. Oh, let's catch that vision. Oh God, You're not looking for perfect parents who know how to do all the right things, but parents who have a vision that comes from You, and by Your grace will seek to realize it. Will stand against all the things that would hurt and harm, and allow the things that are good and great because of the goal that You've given to us. Thank You for Your goodness and mercy. Thank You that You will help us, for You're the great Father of us all. In Jesus' name, amen.